Hello, I'm Jonathan Ross. The documentary you're about to watch means an awful lot, to me at least. It's probably the most personal programme I've ever been involved in, and it deals with a subject that I find intensely fascinating, compellingly important, shamefully unexplored and largely undocumented. It deals with the history of comic books and the history of one comic book character in particular. That's Spider-Man, of course. I have very little doubt that you have, at the very least, heard of him. He's very famous. Spider-Man is one of those handful of fictional creations who is instantly recognisable the world over. An entertainment brand worth billions of dollars to the company that owned him, but not, of course, to the men who created him back in the early 60s. In fact, of the two men most directly linked with the creation of Spider-Man, one of them receives hardly any credit at all, has accepted no money from the millions of dollars generated by the movies and the endless stream of merchandising that accompanies them, and lives a modest, intensely private life in New York City. He's never given an in-depth interview to anyone. He hasn't really spoken about the creation of his work ever. And yet his artistic talent and brilliant body of work have probably given me more pleasure in my life than any other person working in any of the entertainment industries. His name is Steve Ditko, and I'm going looking for him. This is one of only 3 or 4 photographs of the elusive Steve Ditko known to exist, and trust me, I've spent an inordinate amount of time searching for others. Why? Well, I'm more than just a little bit obsessed by his work. Ever since I first saw his art, I was hooked. More than any other comic book artist, his work stays with you. It is far more dramatic, far more insanely imaginative, and far more personal than it needs to be. His style is unique, and from the little I know about him, his life seems just as unusual and perhaps as strange as his work. Although Spider-Man is probably Ditko's crowning achievement, he'd worked in the comic book industry for many years before that character first appeared in 1962. And he continued creating bizarre and colourful characters for many decades after he stopped breathing life into everyone's favourite wall crawler. But Spider-Man is still the one character that fans return to. Now, Spider-Man was different. He was about as far removed from the chisel-jawed adults like Superman and Batman who previously dominated the scene. Spider-Man was a character that puny, bespectacled comic book fans like me could directly relate to. Superman was an all-powerful alien. Batman, an orphaned multi-millionaire who lived above a cave filled with jets and cars and shared his life with a young boy in tights. Nice work if you could get it, but clearly fantasies. Spider-Man, on the other hand, was a puny, unpopular teenager who lived with his old aunt and uncle and endured the same kind of hell every day at school that most of his readers did. We loved him because before he had the good fortune to get bitten by a radioactive spider, we were him. My love of comic books goes back to when I was a kid. This is me enjoying one of my favourites back in 1969. Although actually, I wasn't really that cool, I'm afraid, so you're going to have to go, mate. I was more like this. Come on in. Yeah, enjoy that. And like some kids, are obsessed with sport and others with taking fast cars without the owner's consent and driving them around run-down estates before inevitably enjoying a short stay at Her Majesty's pleasure, I lived and breathed for the joy that these cheaply produced 4-colour epics gave me. Although, to be honest, I wasn't able to afford this one until I was about 30, so I'm going to have to take that off you, and you won't see that again for over 20 years, mate. You might think I am alone in my adoration of Spider-Man. You might think that I am somehow socially or emotionally retarded to still have such great passion for something aimed essentially at children and created almost 50 years ago. But I am not alone. I begin my quest to discover more about Steve Ditko right here in London. Isn't that a great cover? Look. You know. Now, the easily upset among you might wish to turn away. You see before you 3 grown men indulging themselves in their passion for comics in a room I have at home dedicated to those 4-colour masterpieces.
My name is Paul Gambaccini, and I am a Steve Ditko reader since 1960.
Paul loves the early Spider-Man books as much for the human drama they contain as the superheroics.
It's the ultimate soap opera. It was really probably the first soap opera for us, school students, that we ever were exposed to. They had personal problems. They weren't just invulnerable heroes who had a weakness such as the color yellow or green kryptonite. These were characters whose problems were they loved an old woman who they had to support. Aunt May in this case. What made Ditko's Spider-Man so different was that these problems were the problems that the audience had. He was in high school, so he had to struggle to get good grades, but after the murder of Uncle Ben, he had to earn enough money to support himself and Aunt May. So he's the breadwinner. Plus he's a student, plus he's a superhero. Oh my God, how do you do all three at once? Oh, yeah.
Oh, I love
Yeah, yeah.
Just like Paul and myself, Mark Millar is also a big Ditko fan. And in 2004, he realised his dream of becoming the first and thus far only Brit to write the Spider-Man series.
When I did Spider-Man, the only stuff I read as research was, the Ditko run, because to me that was the heart of it. It was the seed that was planted that's now Spider-Man. Everything that made Spider-Man successful in the beginning is the opposite of what is big now. Big, flashy, stylized art and good-looking people is what sells comics now. But back then, the ugliness and the ordinariness is what made it a big hit. It was about everyday stuff, and nobody for me epitomised that more than probably Ditko, I would say.
Although Ditko was responsible for the art, the man behind the scripting was the legendary Stan Lee. Although together they only produced less than 40 Spider-Man adventures, the huge impact they had on the comic book industry is undeniable. But just as Spider-Man's popularity was beginning to soar, helping Marvel to become the #1 company in the business, Steve Ditko walked away from the character without a word of warning. Of course, there have been rumours, there's been speculation, there's been gossip, but Steve Ditko has never spoken out about why he walked out, and not knowing still drives me a little bit nuts. To unravel the mystery of Steve Ditko, I need to delve deeper into the world of the comic book creator. So I'm going to meet some of the most talented and opinionated people working in the comic book industry today, in the hope that they can offer me some insight. In my opinion, there are only a handful of comic creators who really deserve to be considered masters. Steve Ditko is one, Jack Kirby another, and Stan Lee, the man they both worked with for many years, a third. But if I were forced to offer an opinion as to who is the greatest talent still working in comics today, then I wouldn't even hesitate. His name is Moore, Alan Moore, and like me, he's a Ditko fan. But unlike me, he chooses to live and work in Northampton. I've had my jabs. Northampton, here I come. Along with Frank Miller, Alan Moore is widely regarded as one of the saviours of the modern comic book. He released Watchmen in 1986, reinventing the graphic novel with its dark and twisted view of humanity.
At Overston Park, Northampton, the Caravan Club holds its annual rally with hundreds of caravans from all over the country, and it's an ideal holiday for the kiddies. Now, I wonder what's behind that screen.
My name is Alan Moore. I am a comic writer and magician living in Northampton. I probably first encountered Steve Ditko's work when I was 7 or 8. I probably wouldn't even have known that it was Steve Ditko at the time. There was a kind of elegance, a tormented elegance to the way that his characters stood, the way that they bent their hands. There was something even in the 9-panel page grids that he used to habitually use that brought a kind of claustrophobia, a kind of paranoia to the work. His characters always looked very highly strung. They always looked as if they were on the edge of some kind of revelation or breakdown. There was something a bit feverish about Steve Ditko, and I pursued my love of Ditko well into adulthood, and it became a kind of low-level addiction. And there was something about the way that Ditko handled a superhero in Spider-Man which made it a feature of the urban landscape. In Superman and Batman, buildings were just to be flown past. But as with Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko brought this quality to his cityscapes that had real character. It was a slightly paranoid and shadowy character, but that suited very much the kind of introspective, often melancholy mood of a lot of those early Spider-Man episodes.
Spider-Man, Spider-Man.
New York was an inspiration for Ditko. In 1953, he moved there from a small mining town in Pennsylvania and made it his and Spider-Man's home.
Here comes the Spider-Man.
And it was here that he joined the Cartoonist and Illustrators School. I went uptown to meet his mentor and teacher, one of the true pioneers of the comic book industry, Jerry Robinson.
Well, I guess I'm best known in the comics for my work on Batman. I was one of the three original team. Of course, one of the notable contributions, I suppose, is the creation of the Joker.
It's remarkable.
I have some permanent.
Here we have some of Jerry's covers here. Look at that. That's got to be the definitive.
A lot of fans like that one best.
I love
don't
this
know
one.
why.
Of course, that's a classic image.
First one.
Jerry taught Steve in the 50s, and even then he noticed Steve's phenomenal ability.
Well, he was serious about the art. He was serious about learning. He was dedicated to learning. He was dedicated to becoming a storyteller, a visual storyteller.
As part of the course, Jerry would find work for the students in the industry.
I wanted to introduce the artists to doing professional work as early as possible. That's the best way to learn, is to do something and then see your work in print and having to do something of professional standards.
Jerry hooked Steve up with Stan Lee at Atlas Comics, soon to become Marvel. Although Mr. Ditko hasn't worked full-time for any one comic book company for decades now, I felt my search wouldn't be complete unless I visited the home of his earliest triumphs, Marvel Comics in New York City, where there are still some who remember working with Steve in the early days. Although today Marvel is a multi-million-dollar organisation, back then, when Steve joined in 1956, there were just a handful of artists. Notable amongst them was the great Jack Kirby, widely accepted as the most influential comic book artist of all time. And of course, there was Stan Lee, writer and editor-in-chief. Apart from the comics, one of the few documents of that time is this rather strange record that Stan Lee made for the ever-growing Marvel readership.
Okay, out there in Marvel-land, face front, this is Stan Lee speaking. You've probably never heard a record like this before because no one would be nutty enough to make one with a bunch of offbeat artists, so anything is liable to happen.
You belong to the Merry Marvel Marching Society.
This flexi disc, given free to fan club members, featured the Merry Marvel Marching Society song and a few words from the comic creators themselves. But of course, the reclusive Steve Ditko is noticeably absent from the record.
Hey, what's all that commotion out there, Sol?
Why, it's Shy Steve Ditko. He heard you're making a record and he's got mic fright. Whoops, there he goes.
Out the window again? You know, I'm beginning to think he is Spider-Man.
You mean he isn't?
Be a good advisor.
Never ever vicious. Where will you be then?
Say hello to the fans, Flo Steinberg.
Hello, fans. It's very nice to meet you.
Hello, I'm Flo Steinberg, and I had the distinct pleasure of working for Stan Lee at Marvel Comics from 1963 to 1968.
Okay, let him hear it, gang.
You would hear them shouting, or Stan would jump on the desk to make a point. I mean, they were superheroes. I wasn't actually in the room, but you could hear them through the thin walls shouting, and, you know, maybe sometime if something was going on in our office, we'd have to say, hey, keep it down, or something.
March along, march along, march along to the song.
Although Flo doesn't seem to have changed, over the years the rest of the staff have. Marvel has now grown into a corporation of over 500 workers.
Joe Quesada, I'm editor-in-chief of Marvel Comics.
Joe Quesada joined Marvel in the 90s and, of course, is an enormous fan of Ditko.
Between Kirby and Ditko, you had probably two of the best masters in the field. You know, Kirby with the way that his characters moved in that very big, over-dramatic sense, and Steve with a much more subtler approach, but yet creating iconic imagery like Spider-Man shooting the webs. Steve was also creating costumes for characters that had never really been seen before. At that point, it was all traditionally, hey, put the guy's underwear over the tights. It was sort of the strong man in the circus kind of costume.
There's the belt with the buckle, their gloves,
the boots, the whole thing, right? And yet Steve created this bizarre, and I could only put it in the time and place, because to me I see Spider-Man now and it's commonplace. But I could only imagine when this was created in '62 that people looking at it going, that's the weirdest costume ever. And his face is covered, which is, a huge change from what has come before, where usually characters, if they're getting masked, they wear the cowl, with a little domino mask kind of thing. That's one of the reasons why Spider-Man is so relatable. When he puts on that mask, he could be anyone.
Cool Spidey outfit. Thanks. Where'd you get it? I made it. Looks uncomfortable. It gets kind of itchy.
In the years following Steve Ditko's decision to leave Spider-Man, the character's popularity continued to boom. There was this rather poor animation series in 1967, although, admittedly, that's one hell of a catchy tune. The 70s saw Spidey go live action with this TV series filled with overacting extras.
Did you see that? Did you see it, Captain? That's the Spider-Man, the guy in the paper. Who is that character, anyway?
And this rather brilliant oddity from Turkey shows a different side to Spider-Man, casting him as a ruthless, evil sadist.
Çalıştırın.
No two ways about it, Spider-Man is big business on a global scale. And it all stems from those early days back in the Marvel offices.
My name is Ralph Macchio, and I am one of the senior editors up here at Marvel Comics.
Ralph Macchio has worked at Marvel for 30 years, editing the adventures of Spider-Man and Daredevil, among others, and he has first-hand experience of working with Steve Ditko.
It was fascinating because he would sit there with me over my shoulder and he would go through every single page, panel by panel. And it was like watching a master at work, because I would be able to see how he would solve story problems. And he would just sit there, he'd have the plot on one side, he'd be over my shoulder, he'd have the paper in front of me, do it on loose leaf paper, and he would go into this, and this. The writer had a problem here, and I solved it this way. And you would just watch this guy, who was really a genius at storytelling, solve all these problems. And then once I approved it, as if I was ever not going to approve anything Steve Ditko did, he would take it, he would go away, a couple of weeks later he'd come back, and all the pencils would be done.
Although we've spoken almost exclusively about Spider-Man, there was another creation of Ditko's that was cleaning up with the fans. He was never as popular as Spider-Man, never will be, although he continues to crop up in other comic books, and every few years Marvel Comics dust him off and give him a new series. He was a surgeon, perhaps the greatest in the world, but he was vain and proud and callous towards others. Then a car crash left him with paralysed hands, a genius no longer able to perform. And so he went in search of a cure, finding salvation of a different sort, and in the process becoming a master of a different skill, the occult. I give you Dr. Strange, master of the mystic arts. Doctor Strange first appeared in July 1963 as the backup feature in Marvel's Strange Tales.
When you open the first Doctor Strange story, the Nightmare story, and there's this rain on the window pane, and you pull in on this guy who obviously cannot sleep, you're immediately sucked into the story. It's got this film noir kind of quality to it. The panels are small, but yet at the same time the landscapes are expansive. When Doctor Strange gets into his ectoplasmic form, goes into the nightmare dimension, you begin to see these shapes and you begin to see these geometric things, and it's just incredible.
I don't think any other artist would have dared have pages where there are just little pathways into shapes I mean, Doctor Strange is going into some other place, and it's a shape.
Doctor Strange's entire universe, with all of these psychedelic floating giant mouths and cubes and spheres, you suspect that probably Ditko was investing an awful lot of his own personal symbology in just the odd floating shapes in the background.
He really is almost being psychedelic before people took drugs.
Hello, my name is Kat Ironwood, and I've been involved in comics as an editor for many years. My interest in Steve Ditko goes back to my teenage years when I first was reading Marvel Comics, and I loved Doctor Strange. I saw Spider-Man and I liked it, but Doctor Strange just sort of did something for me. It was very exciting to me because it was so unusual. Me and my friends who were Ditko cultists, who were hippies, who used marijuana and psychotropics of various sorts, DMT, LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, peyote. We certainly believed that Steve Ditko was on drugs.
If you read the Tom Wolfe's Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, a lot of the characters in there would take the Doctor Strange comic and they would look at the pages and they would start dropping acid.
Very odd piece of work in that Steve Ditko, who was politically very conservative, was suddenly the idol of a whole generation of hippies who were reading some kind of drug parable into these colourful other dimensions that Doctor Strange was zipping through, all without ever leaving his Greenwich Village apartment. He would just be sitting there on the floor in a trance while imagining that he was battling the dread Dormammu in some kind of zone of the nether dimensions.
I asked Steve about that. I said, Steve, I know you're not into hallucinogens and all that. I said, where did that come from? He said it was just thought. He said, I just put a lot of thought into what another world would look like. And this is what came out of his head.
But there are things about Ditko that are unusual, and there are people who seek those unusual states by taking drugs, and there are people who were sure that Steve Ditko had taken drugs, but I don't think it's so. I think that Ditko just had an unusual mind.
In the name of Rael, scourge of demons, I command you, begone. Say it.
In the name of Rael, scourge of demons, I command you, begone.
Must be exactly those words.
How do I get back?
On the astral planes, action follows thought. Will yourself to return to Earth. Hold the thought in your mind, and you'll come back.
When does it begin?
Now.
If Ditko wasn't on drugs when he created Doctor Strange in the 1960s, then it's hard to believe that the people who tried to bring him to the small screen in this 1970s TV pilot weren't on something. There was a Doctor Strange pilot. I don't know if you ever saw that.
I've seen still pictures of it. And based on the still pictures, I could see why it probably didn't work.
It's not a terribly good, it's not a terribly thrilling viewing experience. Right. So with Doctor Strange a genuine cult hit and Spider-Man going from strength to strength, it's clear that Steve Ditko was at the height of his powers, and his partnership with Stan Lee was a huge commercial success. But in a move that surprised everyone except presumably Ditko himself, he walked away from both those comics and Marvel without a word of warning. He was never to illustrate an issue of Doctor Strange or Spider-Man ever again. It was the equivalent in the comic book world of John Lennon leaving Paul McCartney after releasing Help. And to get to grips with the most mysterious moment in comic book history, I'd like to introduce another great comic book creator and big Ditko fan.
My name is Neil Gaiman. I'm a writer. One of the things I write is comics.
Neil has worked for all the major comic book companies and is the creator of the sublime Sandman. He believes that Steve may have walked out on his collaborator Stan Lee for political reasons.
There are famously a number of issues that they clashed over. Stan is meant to have looked at comments of Ditko's where Spider-Man is swinging past protesters, and he's meant to be saying things like, now just look at those dirty hippies down there. And Stan would go in and give him a word balloon that says, hey kids, I'm with you, or whatever. And you feel that, you know, politically, there's a wonderful sort of clash there between swinging Stan Lee and magnificently uptight, world-class uptight, impossibly uptight Steve Ditko.
Another theory was the disagreement about the revelation of the identity of Spider-Man's nemesis, the Green Goblin.
Should the Green Goblin be a man in the street, or should he be somebody that we'd known who was close to and we'd liked and looked up to?
Steve wanted it to be someone that no one had seen before, that this was just a random character, because he said in real life, chances are if there was somebody like this, you wouldn't know who it was. But Stan felt for dramatic purposes, if you reveal who the Green Goblin is, it has to be someone in the cast.
I've heard the Green Goblin story too, that he didn't want the Green Goblin to be Norman because he felt it was, you know, what are the chances that your arch nemesis is your best friend's father?
Obviously, Stan was right. Stan's instincts as a storyteller were absolutely spot on.
But Steve was pretty adamant about that. He felt, no, in real life, this is not the way things would go.
Yet another supposed deal breaker was whether Peter Parker should graduate from college.
I know when I talked with him, again, a lot had to do with what he felt was the essence of Peter Parker, that this was a high school character, that once you graduated him from high school, it was just no longer a character that could make mistakes. So it was time for him to leave and go on and do other things.
And to me, there's been all these stories about the reason that Stan and Steve did split up on Spider-Man. You know, it's the story about the Green Goblin. There's the story that, you know, Ditko didn't like some of the psychological stuff that was creeping into it. You know, he felt as if there was a veiled liberalism in Stan's scripts. But to me, in all honesty, I think it is just that kind of creative urge to go off and do something on your own. You've just reached a point where you feel, I'm not really getting the attention I deserve here. I'm going to go and prove I can do it myself.
Steve just came in one day, dropped off his last Spider-Man, and told whoever it was that was there, that was it. He was done, and he was leaving.
Both Spider-Man and Doctor Strange were big hits with Marvel fans, so Ditko's leaving potentially posed huge problems for the company. Stan Lee moved quickly to replace him. I went to Long Island to meet the man who had the tough task of stepping into Ditko's shoes.
I'm John Romita, worked for Marvel for probably 40 years. And had a ball and paid off my mortgage.
John Romita was working on the reasonably successful Daredevil series when he was asked to take over Spider-Man from Steve Ditko.
Losing a guy like Ditko could have been catastrophic for Marvel in its infancy, and yet here's a guy like John Romita just in the wings. It was a magical time, and that's how these things happen.
I wouldn't have been able to pick up Spider-Man and hit the ground running if it hadn't been established so beautifully and so soundly. It was a working machine when I got it, and all I had to do was put the oil in.
But John and Steve's styles were radically different, and John had difficulty copying Steve's idiosyncratic look.
Stan liked Ditko's offbeat stuff, and what he liked about it was that Peter Parker was not a heroic kid. He was a scrawny young kid who's a little off, a little strange, can't get along, you know. And for some reason, when I take over a book, all my heroes are handsome.
Incredibly handsome.
I can't help it. I started to clean things up and toothpaste smile everybody to death, and I thought it was going to kill it. I really thought it was. And Stan did. Stan said, no, it's not going to work. And I said, well, I'll try, I'll try. Finally, he just threw his hands up and said, do it the way you want.
John Romita's toothpaste smile soon spread to the Marvel management when his new-look Spider-Man became an even bigger hit with the public. Within a year, Spider-Man shot into the top 10 highest-earning comics.
See, Ditko his version of what he was doing was true. It's just that it didn't fit Stan's commercial sense. And Stan had an uncanny commercial sense. And any artist that fought him on it, I think, was making a terrible mistake, because Ditko could have made a fortune. Now, I guess he doesn't care. He didn't care about money.
Well, he doesn't seem to care at all even now when they ask him.
Right. I mean, so his objectives were different than mine. I was just trying to pay my mortgage off. And I wanted to get the best-selling book I could. And I stayed with Spider-Man as long as possible because I'm making money, you know. And he baffled me. And I admire him, and I wish he hadn't done it, because I would love to have seen him independently wealthy now.
Spider-Man sales may have gone through the roof, but the Ditko fans were disappointed.
Steve Ditko had got so much of his DNA in all of the characters that he created. I mean, I know that there were good issues of Spider-Man after he finished the book with issue 35, something like that. I know that John Romita did some very good work on Spider-Man, but I kind of lost interest with the first non-Ditko issue, because the character was so much a part of Ditko's world that it looked kind of dull when it was an ordinarily muscled man in a Spider-Man costume.
Although he left Marvel, he didn't, of course, leave the world of comics. First, he went to a company called Charlton, based in Connecticut, who never enjoyed the success of the big companies and paid considerably less, but rather tellingly had a reputation for letting artists and writers do more or less what they wanted without editorial intervention. And it was at Charlton that he created a bizarre character who, I believe, gave us our first glimpse of Ditko's peculiar worldview, the Question. The Question was a detective named Vic Sage, whose only real powers were his unwavering moral compass and his intelligence. Donning a featureless mask, he would release a special gas that turned him into the Question, ready to fight crime in any way necessary.
You can start to see the weirdness in the books after Spider-Man and Doctor Strange, the immediate late 60s books, the Charlton characters, the Question. There's a lot of didacticism in that character.
There was something about Ditko's characters where I began to wonder whether they had come to him in dreams. There was something so odd about them that they looked like the kind of almost nonsensical characters that you might see the name of or the image of in a dream and jot it down when you woke up.
But the Question, with his uncompromising take on law and order, comes across like a limp-wristed liberal when compared to Ditko's most extreme creation, Mr. A. Ditko created Mr. A for an independent comic publisher called Wits End. Mr. A was a radical, no-nonsense vigilante who had a very low tolerance of anyone who infringed the rights of the individual and would mete out severe punishments to those who foolishly strayed into the quicksand of moral ambiguity.
Anybody who'd even committed the merest of crimes was wandering into this poisonous grey area. They were tainted, and they could only expect the kind of terrible punishment that his Mr. A was likely to mete out to them.
Mr. A's world was one of black and white, right and wrong, good and evil. And it's clear that those ideas were influenced by Ditko's interest in the work of this woman, Ayn Rand.
You see, my main interest and purpose, both in literature and in philosophy, is to define and present the image of an ideal man.
Ayn Rand enjoyed a surge of popularity in the US after releasing her philosophical novels, The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged. Both works of fiction, they expressed Ayn Rand's theories of individualism. She believed man's ultimate goal was personal fulfillment through a rational code of morality, a worldview that she referred to as objectivism. Steve was profoundly influenced by objectivism and used his art to spread the word in the form of Mr. A.
Mr. A's black and white card symbolizes the law of identity. It identifies the two moral potentials possible, the good and the evil, and by one's chosen action, the best or the worst potential can be actualized. The card is also a symbol of justice. For Ayn Rand, justice is objectively identifying a thing for what it is and treating it accordingly. No one gets the unearned. The innocent is not penalized, the guilty is not rewarded.
You know, Steve Ditko obviously would like me to read these and see the light and step into the light and become an objectivist and become an Ayn Randian philosopher like what he is. And instead, I wind up reading them as something closer to classic American outsider art. They move more into the realm of just sheer, beautiful, wonderful, straight from the heart American barking madness than I think, and that's the level on which I appreciate them. They don't even pretend to be stories. There is good, there is evil, there is no grey area.
One of the stories that I remember hearing, I think from Marv Wolfman, about Steve Ditko was him going to visit Steve Ditko when I think Steve was living above a thrift store somewhere in New York, and they'd had a pleasant conversation, and before Marv Wolfman left, Steve Ditko said, I just want to show you something. And he took a little white, empty calling card and took a magic marker, drew a line down the middle, and shaded one half of the card in black and said, there is white and there is black and there is nothing in between.
Ditko's creations, Mr. A and The Question, were a big influence on the character Rorschach in Alan Moore's classic graphic novel, Watchmen.
The most unpleasant right-wing character is Rorschach. He almost ends up as the hero of the book. He's certainly the character who seems to have the most ferocious integrity. Even if his politics are completely mad, he has this ferocious moral integrity that has made him one of the most popular characters in the book. And obviously, that ferocious moral drive and integrity, that was kind of my take upon Steve Ditko. Somebody had been interviewing Ditko and had said, have you ever heard of this book, Watchmen? And he said, what's that? And they said, well, it's got this character in called Rorschach. And he said, oh, yes, Rorschach. He's like Mr. A, except he's insane.
Most of Ditko's fans found the character of Mr. A tad extreme, and I suspect that many were shocked to realise that Ditko's politics were somewhat different to their own.
Kids, meaning teenagers, college students, who were eating up Marvel Comics at that time, did not want to be told, you can either do it the right way or you're wrong. Young people don't like to be told that they're wrong, and Steve was being too stern for them, and he lost them. And he never got it back.
Steve Ditko's return to mainstream comics and more obviously commercial characters came in 1968 when he joined Marvel's biggest rivals, DC, and served up two typically offbeat new creations, The Hawk and the Dove and The Creeper. The Hawk and the Dove seems to be an attempt by Steve to dramatise the two opposing sides of the debate over the Vietnam War.
The Hawk side of the equation is perhaps a little bit non-intellectual, perhaps a bit headstrong, but he's a big, rugged, can-do action hero. The Dove half of the equation is a simpering, effete character in a lackluster blue and white costume. And all he does, he doesn't get into fights, he stands around and agonises about the need for violence. It was obvious where Ditko's sympathies lied in the equation.
He then baffled everyone with a creation known as the Creeper, a superhero with strange powers.
Basically, the only thing that the Creeper had going for him was his freakishness. He just used to sort of jump around in a yellow and green and red garish costume laughing. And this seemed to be his major superpower, that he could laugh at will.
While other publishers allowed Steve to create odder and odder characters in the hope that he would lay another golden egg, Marvel went on to enjoy monumental success on the back of Spider-Man, not only from the comics, but more importantly, the licensing of films, games and toys. Doctor Strange, look, you see, and even there, even after this time, in the background there, that Marvel Masterwork pin-up is a Steve Ditko. So this is a toy now in the year 2007. Maybe this was from 2 years ago or something. And it's a clearly Ditko influenced design and artwork. And look, does he get his name on anywhere? No. That's not fair. More often than not, the writer, in the case of both Spider-Man and Doctor Strange, that writer was Stan Lee, who was also Marvel Comics editor-in-chief at the time, received more or less full credit for the characters. But recently, fans have come to realise that things weren't that simple. If his only contribution to Spider-Man's world had been the costume, then Ditko deserved a credit, but it was much more than that. In fact, in the case of Doctor Strange, it was everything.
There does exist a hardcover anthology of Steve Ditko called Marvel Visionaries Steve Ditko, and in the introduction it prints a postcard that Stan Lee had sent me, which I gave to the comic reader, saying that we've got a 5-page filler coming up in Strange Tales. Nothing great, but we might be able to do something with him. It's by Steve Ditko. It's called Doctor Strange. 'Twas his idea. 'Twas Steve's idea. That's a quote. And Marvel have even printed it. So we now know for sure that was Steve's idea.
I mean, Steve Ditko, as far as I understood it, has lived in some very reduced circumstances throughout his life. When Marvel have been raking in money hand over fist with characters that he created or co-created, but which essentially, in my heart, were Steve Ditko creations. When I was with a local band that we'd put together about 10, 15 years ago now, called The Emperors of Ice Cream, we had this song called Mr. A. It was the main chorus was a shameless rip-off of Sister Ray by the Velvet Underground. But the verses, I thought they were quite memorable. Would you like me to give you
would we?
A performance,
Come
Jonathan?
on, let's have this. This is gold.
He had one room above a thrift store. He had a trunk of books by Ayn Rand. He was short-sighted and reclusive, resisting pleas to take his photograph. He drew a superhero comic. He saw the world in terms of black and white. He said a day's work for a day's pay. That is our one and only right. He takes a card and shades one half of it in dark so he can demonstrate to you just what he means. He says there's black and there is white, and there is wrong and there is right, and there is nothing in between. That's what Mr. A said.
In trying to uncover the facts in this strange case of Steve Ditko, master of the comic arts, one other name occurs again and again. Stan Lee, or Stan the Man is his credit on some of the most successful and influential comics in the history of the medium read. For many years, he was considered the sole creator of such fabulous and lucrative characters as the Hulk, the X-Men, the Fantastic Four, Iron Man, and of course, the Amazing Spider-Man. Now, Stan himself did very little to clarify or correct that assumption, and it's only comparatively recently that his co-creators have got anything like the credit they so clearly deserve. To be fair, Stan's always been a showman, and he's even gone on record to jokingly remark that he'll happily take any credit that isn't nailed down. But I'm still intrigued to find out what he remembers about the early days, and whether or not he believes that Steve Ditko deserves to receive that credit as the co-creator of Spider-Man.
We've just landed at the film star's own terminal, Los Angeles Airport. It's a new world we've arrived in, and surprisingly not an expensive one, because the fabulous sunshine and the fabulous sights, at least, are completely free. Just study life at street level, California style, where the whole flavor of the place hits you in the eye as you drive into town.
Hi, my name is Stan Lee, and I was the head writer, editor, and art director at Marvel Comics for many years. I thought up the Fantastic Four, and it did well. So we did another book called The Hulk, and then we did Spider-Man and the X-Men, and on and on. And, of course, on the seventh day, I rested.
Now, it would be easy to make Stan Lee out to be the villain of the piece, but I can't bring myself to do that, not least because it would be unfair. He co-created all of these characters. He wrote some of the greatest Marvel comic books of all time, and the fact that he takes the credit for doing so is absolutely right. I just wish that he would share it out with the guys he worked with a little more.
Steve and I worked beautifully together. I think, as far as I was concerned, he was the perfect collaborator. His artwork was superb. His story sense was brilliant. His continuity, he drew things you thought you were watching a motion picture from panel to panel. I mean, he was a joy and a delight to work with. I was heartbroken when Steve finally stopped working with us. In the very beginning, I would come up with a rather detailed plot, tell Steve what it was. He would draw the strip any way he wanted. I didn't give him a complete script. He'd add a lot of things that I hadn't even thought of. And then I would get the pages of artwork, and I would put in the dialogue, trying to give everything and everyone the personality that I wanted them to have. As we moved along, I saw that Steve was so good at story that little by little, I had him come up with most of the plots. I would only say to him something like, hey, let's use Sandman as the next villain, and let's have Sandman try to kidnap Mary Jane, or whatever it was. I might not say any more than that, and he would do the story, give it to me, and then I would try to hold everything together with my dialogue and captions. Again, after a while, I wouldn't even say that much to Steve. He would just go and do whatever story he wanted, bring me the artwork. It was like doing a crossword puzzle. I'd get the artwork. It was all something I hadn't seen before. I didn't know what to expect, but it was up to me now to put the words and captions and sound effects or whatever in and make it seem like a cohesive whole.
In the past, Stan Lee has often been referred to as the sole creator of Spider-Man, something that has upset the publicity-shy Steve Ditko.
He had complained to me a number of times when there were articles written about Spider-Man which called me the creator of Spider-Man. And I had always thought I was, because I'm the guy who said, I have an idea for a strip called Spider-Man, and so forth.
Steve obviously felt differently, and in 1999, in a small fanzine, he depicted the two sides of the story as he saw it. This is his only known response to the claims that Spider-Man was solely Stan Lee's creation.
Steve had said, having an idea is nothing, because until it becomes a physical thing, it's just an idea. And he said it took him to draw the strip and to give it life, so to speak, or to make it actually something tangible. Otherwise, all I had was an idea. So I said to him, well, I think the person with the idea is the person who creates it. And he said, no, because I drew it. Anyway, Steve definitely felt that he was the co-creator of Spider-Man. And that was really, after he said it, and I saw it meant a lot to him, that was fine with me. So I said, fine, I'll tell everybody you're the co-creator. That didn't quite satisfy him, so I sent him a letter. I put it in writing. To whom it may concern, this is to state that I consider Steve Ditko to be the co-creator of Spider-Man along with me, something like that. And I sent it to him, and I said, you can show this to anybody you want to. And I found out that Steve still objected to that because he felt I used the word consider. I consider Steve to be the co-creator. Apparently, he felt that wasn't definite enough. So at that point, I gave up. I mean, I haven't spoken to him or heard from him since, I don't think.
But do you yourself believe that he co-created it?
I'm willing to say so.
That's not what I'm asking you, Stan.
No, and that's the best answer I can give you.
So it's a no then, really?
Pardon me?
So it's a no then?
No, I really think the guy who dreams the thing up created it. You dream it up and then you give it to anybody to draw it. I mean...
But if it had been drawn differently, it might not have been successful or a hit, I suppose.
Yeah, but then I would have had created something that didn't succeed.
Valid point.
But I don't want to... you made me say that in this documentary that you're doing, and I'm sorry I said it because I'm happy to say I consider Steve to be the co-creator.
But you can see...
I think if Steve wants to be called the co-creator, I think he deserves to be called the co-creator because he had done such a wonderful job.
Stan has told me that he was insistent that on the movies that Steve's name be right alongside his with Spider-Man. So Stan, who to me was a guy who I think unfairly has been kind of seen as a guy who took credit for everything when he had people like Kirby and Ditko working with him. I never saw it that way. I always got the sense when I was reading the books that the two of them were very much in collaboration, and whenever something, again, was plotted by Ditko, it said plotted by Ditko.
And for many a comic book fan, the absolute genius of the Ditko-Lee collaboration was best demonstrated in Spider-Man issue number 33, the final chapter.
Do the list of the greatest superhero moments in comics. Up there, probably at number one, certainly in the top 2 or 3, is Spider-Man crushed by the weight of the fallen masonry, summoning his inner reserves and realizing that, he can do it. And it's a pure Ditko moment as he pulls himself up.
Even the cover is great. It's just a word balloon-less image of Spider-Man struggling to lift the machinery while the water's dripping down on him.
Steve, and it had nothing to do with me, this was all Steve's idea, when he brought me the pages, he had devoted something like 3 full pages just showing Spider-Man pinned under that heavy weight and trying his best to extricate himself.
Steve Ditko's drawing was completely expressive on its own, and the way that he told it in these very small panels with a very small figure of Spider-Man crushed under this immense weight of machinery, it told you everything that you needed to know.
Because he changes the shapes of the panels, he creates the sense of both forward motion in time and the growing importance of the moment, added to the increase in effort that Spider-Man is making.
There were scenes of him like that, and like that. I've got to get it off. I've got to get free for 3 pages.
That sequence made it kind of obvious that it was mainly the visual dynamics that were powering the scene. Yes, Stan Lee was putting balloons in that said, oh, I must try harder, no use, can't do it, and things like that.
Until finally, full page, he lifts the machine off. It's so brilliant a use of the medium. And this is when you bless a creator, because you say, this vindicates comics, because this can only be done in comics.
For most of my life, I've loved and enjoyed the work of Steve Ditko. For many years, I accepted that although he was still alive and well and working, I'd probably never get to read or hear his side of the story, much less meet him. But seeing as we've gone to all this trouble to tell his side of what went on as fairly as possible, I really couldn't give up without trying. So after securing his phone number, I plucked up the courage to visit his office with my trusty sidekick, Neil Gaiman, the boy wonder, and asked for the chance to meet him face to face. I'm very excited. I'm outside this building here on West 51st Street, and we've established that Steve Ditko does still have an office here. So I'm going to call him now with the number, which I hope is correct. I might have to go and check it and see if he will speak to me. Oh, hello, is that Mr. Ditko? Hello, Mr. Ditko. My name's Jonathan Ross. I'm a huge fan of your work, and I'm over here from London, England. Would it be possible for me to pop by and say hello to you and visit you at your studio? No? I couldn't entice you in any way whatsoever. There's no way I could entice you. Just to grasp you manfully by the hand and thank you for the many years of pleasure. Okay. Steve, I just wanted to say hello and thank you so much. Okay. Take care, Steve. Bye-bye. Just spoke to Steve Ditko. Essentially told me to fuck off. But in the most polite and firm manner I've ever encountered. Okay, shall we go and knock on his door?
Do you want to?
Yeah, well, not with the crew, but let's go up there and just see. Let's do it.
Okay.
Okay. Me and Neil are now going to go and upset him, but we've got to do it, haven't we, Neil? How's it feel, Neil?
I feel I am Robin to his Batman. I'm Speedy to his Green Arrow. I am Etta Candy to his Wonder Woman. I think we have to do this.
Etta Candy's an unusual reference point. Okay, see you guys. What should we do? Should we meet you down there in 10 minutes? Just went and shook Steve Ditko's hand and had a long chat with him.
We had a very long chat with him.
We had a long chat with Steve Ditko, and he talked to us about creating Spider-Man, and I said, "Can I ask you a big favour? Could I have my photograph taken?" He went, "Oh no, wouldn't have his photo taken." He was so sweet, wasn't he?
He was just the loveliest man.
We tried to put our head into his room, but he was great.
He gave us comics.
He gave us look. He gave us
comics.
He handed us some of his old comics.
And just absolutely...
And he said if he knew people would come knocking, he kind of wished he hadn't put his name on the door.
It was quite magical, actually. It was really, really cool. He answered all of Jonathan's questions, and even a few of mine, and I think that we shouldn't say any more, really.
We can't talk about it. It's a bit like Fight Club, okay? Yes. The first rule of Fight Club is you don't talk about Fight Club. The first rule of Ditko is we can't share Ditko with you.
Yes.
But we went in search of Steve Ditko, and we found Steve Ditko, and that's all you need to know.
Steve Ditko was an original voice, both in his drawing style and in his writing and his politics. And I would say that today's audiences, if they're going to see things like the Spider-Man films, they should be painfully aware throughout every moment of the film that this is a character that was created by this extraordinary artist, Steve Ditko.
So I went in search of Steve Ditko and I found him. And he was thoroughly decent and nice and charming and patient and didn't want to be filmed or photographed. And although you might feel a little bit let down, I'm afraid that's tough. I'd rather respect the wishes of a reclusive 80-year-old genius than bow to the basic instincts of my beloved audience. If it is any consolation, I can tell you that I phoned Steve, we're on first name terms now, of course, and asked him if I could interview him for this show, and of course, he said no. But in the course of that conversation, I told him just how much his work had meant to me and his thousands of other fans out there, and he seemed genuinely pleased. So it was all worthwhile, he asked. Yes, Steve, I said, it was all worthwhile.
BBC 4's unmissable new series on the history of comic books continues with the symbiotic relationship of child and comic in Comics Britannia, tomorrow at 9. Now next, tonight, comic strip character Modesty Blaze gets her own movie.